It's a pleasure to be here this morning and building on the Bloody Mary comment. In fact, Secretary of Spear was saying that he was doing some polling data before, and it was estimated to be 100 people in attendance, but it looks like the pollers were again wrong, and we exceeded expectation. I was really concerned about attendee suppression, but it looked like that didn't happen. So I'll kind of move back and forth here, so that those of you that stayed up all night watching election returns, if you keep the eye on the moving general, maybe you'll stay awake. And I do appreciate the constant push on the AUSA membership, because I think now I've bought my third lifetime membership. Yeah, so I'm hoping that translates into, extra years to use it or something. Yeah, I guess so. I don't know. So I'm on my third lifetime membership. So, well, as Guy said, last month, October, we rolled out sort of the next phase of the Army's operating concept at a panel. And I do appreciate the great venue given us by AUSA. The title of this, we had our original Army operating concept, which was rolled out 2 years ago at AUSA, Win in a Complex World. We're now refining that down, how to accomplish that. And what we did, actually, is we go back historically, not to be captivated by history, but to be informed by it, and have looked at periods of significant transition in the Army and taken some best practices out when the Army has transitioned. What are some of those things that are timeless, and helped it move through that? And there's a number of things I sort of call first order principles. And General Ham's predecessor here, General Sullivan, always reminded us the intellectual leads the physical. And that, as we transition the Army, and when we have done it successfully, you can point to the intellectual leading the physical, that you have an intellectual visualization and concept, and then you've got to sort of build consensus, and generally that means build understanding about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and then so this consistent and persistent effort to bring it to fruition, and many of these things become decades-long activity. So we have looked back, and quite honestly, one that always jumps out is air-land battle, that really, was a driver in many ways, is the basis for the Army that we have today. As we were coming out of Vietnam, and General Depew and General Starry and all that were pushing it to get maneuver warfare back in. As at that time, I guess they didn't use the term, but we were pivoting to the Central Plains of Europe and the Soviet threat, and how we're going to deal with that. And we came up with air-land battle and maneuver warfare, and then a series of tenets and attributes and dot mil PF solutions came out of that. A couple of years ago, here in the city at least, you heard talks of air-sea battle, another concept developed for a couple of other domains. And so we're looking back at it and said, well, you had air-land battle, and so by definition that's two domains, and air-sea battle, that's two domains. So we said, well, we'll call you and raise you one. And so first slide, please. So our title of ours is MultiDomain Battle. So nobody can say they're left out. So, in this era of elections, a completely bipartisan name up there. But let me tell you sort of the genesis behind this. And so one of the things that has proved useful in periods of transitions of the Army is that there was a real hard look, a lot of analytics done on recent problems around the world, and then how did that sort of extrapolate out toward the future. And so when TRADOC started working on air-land battle under, at that time, General Depew and then General Starry, they took a look at what happened in the 73 Arab-Israeli War. And they had the infamous Starry study. General Starry went over there and took a look at things and saw the sort of proliferation of anti-tank guided missiles on the battlefield, large armored formations, maneuver warfare, the lethality, the speed, and all that. It was very different than what we had experienced in Vietnam. And he came back and said, you know what, the Army we have is just not really built to deal with that. And that is probably what we are going to see maybe for the next decades coming, either fighting the Soviets themselves or surrogate forces. And then the Army set off on a quest, and I would argue that many of the basics that we have in our Army today, even a lot of our doctrine still, and the big five are still with us, really were a result of that. So one of the things we did is we commissioned what I'm referring to as Starry Study 2. General Starry was the Armor Commandant, so this time we took the Infantry Commandant, Brigadier General Pete Jones, and we focused him on go over in Europe and see what's going on in the Ukraine and with surrogate forces and various things like that, and provide some insight about what we've seen there. What does that mean for the Army today? But more importantly, what does it mean by the future? Because in many ways, they are harbingers of things to come. And we're seeing not only adversaries, but potential adversaries or surrogate forces use some capabilities. And what started to come out of that is, as we were working on airland battle, and really the coming out party, the debutante ball for airland battle was Desert Storm. I mean, it was the first time that we really arrayed airland battle as designed, as I read about it, 100-5 and all that. And the world took notice about how effective it was, how it had vanquished a fairly large, fairly modern, heavily mechanized force in the proverbial 100 hours. And it really caught a lot of our adversaries by surprise. You can look at their reflections of what happened. And so they started going to school on the U.S. and have been going to school on us since then. We have been involved in a number of things around the world, Afghanistan, Iraq, and many other things. And so we have our fingers in many pots. But a lot of our adversaries and potential adversaries really looked at what we did in Desert Storm and how we got there and what it took to get there, and really have started to replicate that. And we've seen that now around the world. We see it not to the proficiency and degree that we had, but you can see that's where they're going if you look at what's going on in Syria, Ukraine, and other places, and what their doctrine says. So what Pete Jones and others did was take a look and say, okay, what lessons learned came out of that? And there's really three big things that we see our adversaries around the world trying to do to us, or capabilities that they're trying to apply to us. One of them is, and the term we use is, they are trying to fracture airland battle, because they saw how powerful it was in Desert Storm. So they're like, if we can fracture that, if we can fracture the U.S. Army and the U.S. military sort of back in their domain, so they can't synchronize this joint fight, because we probably do better than anybody else. What we can do is we then can isolate and deal with capabilities piecemeal. Now, what happens a lot of times, though, is instead of the proverbial, I'm going to use a tank against a tank, artillery against artillery, they have started using cyber against artillery, maybe the air domain against the land domain. So instead of going head-to-head with us, weapon system by weapon system, they're trying to figure out where do we have an asymmetric weakness, either in a weapon system or doctrine, and attack it asymmetrically. This is sort of becoming the battle of the asymmetries, and come at us from different angles. Whereas air-land battle kind of was tanks against tanks, artillery against artillery, air against air, and maneuver through the depth of the battlefield. So they're coming at us trying to fracture air-land battle, but doing it asymmetrically via other domains. Because to take us on sometimes directly head-on, they can't afford it. But they can afford some asymmetric capabilities, and even non-nation states. The second thing that they focus on, and we heard this term a lot, is they want to keep us out of the area of operations. So you hear A2AD, anti-access area denial. Because what they have seen time and time again, that if the U.S. Army and or military gets a foothold in your area of operation, you will never get them out, even if they want to leave. They never leave. So they'll just get there and they'll build more and more and more and more, and they just don't get out. And once that starts, it is really hard to sort of kick them off the continent. And you look at all the way back from World War I on. Once they get there, it gets very difficult. So they try to keep us at arm's length, anti-access area denial. So you see a proliferation of fires, long-range fires. They're getting into precision munitions, and they tend to focus on some of the domains that it's easier to do that in. And part of it has to do with physics. It has nothing to do with the branches of service. So in the maritime and air domain, by the laws of physics, has nothing to do with, better trained people or anything, those domains are more homogeneous domains. You don't have nearly the clutter you have in our domain, the land domain, okay? Our domain is anything but homogeneous. We have IV lines. We have huge population centers. You have all kinds of things that make having a homogeneous solution very difficult. The physics of air and maritime allow you to have fairly homogeneous solutions. Technology has a different, it has a different characteristic in those domains because of the homogeneity of the domain. Sometimes you can have a technology that works somewhat universally in those domains and it doesn't work in the land domain. So the human element becomes incredibly important in our domain. And, but we see a focus on keeping us out, keeping us away. And the third thing we see is a desire to fracture us by domain, fracture air-land battle, keep us at arm's length, and fix us. Don't let us maneuver. Because what they have seen when they saw the 7th Corps do the big hook and when they have seen activity in the OF-1 and all that, when the U.S. military maneuvers, that's a very difficult dilemma to deal with. Because now what's happening is the op tempo and purse tempo of the environment is starting to move very quickly. And the quicker the operational tempo of the combat, generally the advantage accrues to the U.S. and our coalition allies. Because our people are better trained. We generally have better, though not perfect, mission command and control systems, et cetera. And, you know, we just hook and jab much better. And it does give us an advantage over numbers and even technology, et cetera, like that. Because to maneuver requires a very high level of training. And so if you look around the world, if you have not as well-trained forces, they tend to be much more static and much more fire-centric. If you have very well-trained forces, they tend to maneuver, okay? And they tend to offset being outnumbered, even range issues, with maneuvering capability on the battlefield and bringing it together. And so we said if those are the three things our enemies are trying to do for us, we try to collate them into sort of, you know, big three things you can focus on. We said that way we've got to get after this. We've got to figure out how do we deal with this anti-access area denial problem? How do we deal with this desire for our enemies to fix us so that we can't maneuver? And how do we make sure that it's very difficult for them to fracture what we put together? So we have multi-domain battle, and I like to, a couple of first-order principles here. What we're saying is, what we want to create is freedom of maneuver. That generally is the U.S. and our allies' greatest advantage. And we know they're trying to take that away from us. And so, you know, I'll look at scenarios around the world, and they'll have a continent, and they'll have a big A2AD umbrella over it as if there's this big impenetrable bubble over half of a continent. My experience is it's very difficult to put an impenetrable bubble over half a continent. As a brigade commander going to the NTC, I thought I had an A2AD umbrella over the central corridor, which later found out there were a few gaps in it, okay? So if you look at these A2AD umbrellas, generally speaking, the domain that it is easiest to prevent a homogeneous capability to keep you out is land domain. It is much easier to keep you out holistically from air and maritime. Therefore, we're saying the land domain provides you access actually to get at this A2AD umbrella. And what we're saying is, in concert with the other domains, you can see we've got cyber and maritime and all that, that we want to be able to take at a point in time of our choosing what we call a window of domain superiority. And instead of taking this A2AD bubble and cleaning it off the pool table, like from the west side of one continent to the other side, which is going to be very difficult, you penetrate these A2AD umbrellas at a point in time of our choosing. You sort of get in them, and then you start maneuvering. But you just don't maneuver tanks and artillery. You maneuver all of the domains. So you start maneuvering and synchronizing what you're doing in cyber. At the same time, you're doing what you're doing on land, is what you're doing with air, et cetera, like that. And you start kind of collapsing this thing from within. Because if we can raise the op tempo, what that goes on, we start to present more and more and more dilemmas to the enemy that's becoming very difficult for them to mitigate at all. If we just come at them straight on and we go tit for tat, tank for tank, artillery for artillery, and if they're a kind of a static-based fires organization, that sort of this war of attrition thing, that's not to our advantage. And in fact, we look at numbers and things around the world, and that does not play to our strong suit. But if we can penetrate this with these what we call windows of domain superiority, and then follow them up with another domain, and then follow them up with another domain, you now start giving the commander lots and lots of options. A great historical example of this, so it's not necessarily completely new, was the Arab-Israeli War in '73, and the Israeli Air Force, after they lost about 25% of the Israeli Air Force, got destroyed by Egyptian air defense. And after the Israeli Air Force lost 25% of the entire Air Force to Egyptian air defense systems, what they did was take heavy maneuver forces and maneuver the land domain onto the air defense systems that were providing a level of superiority in the air, took them down, opened up a window now of superiority in the air domain, then let the Israeli Air Force go through. They went deep and did AI. So this is not completely new, but what we want to do is not lose 25% of the U.S. Air Force or 25% of the U.S. Navy before we kind of figure that out. So what does that mean then? I mean, what does that mean for the Army when you look at a .mil-PF, Doctrine, Organization, Training, Leader Development, et cetera, like that? Go to the next slide. One example of that is cross-domain fires. So what we're talking about now is not just land-to-land fires, but how about land-to-maritime, land-to-air, land-to-space, cyber-to-land, et cetera. When you start thinking about this, you now are putting a number of options and dilemmas presenting them to the enemy and options to the commander that now allow us to maneuver through all of those domains and use all that capability. So if you had, an example I'll use, if you had a U.S. Army land-based artillery system, okay, and you had it capable of having anti-ship missiles in the U.S. artillery system, you then could take that U.S. Army artillery system and place it on an unsinkable ship known as land, and then provide a dilemma to adversaries' navy, especially at some well-known choke points around the world, that if that navy is now within range of U.S. Army artillery batteries with anti-ship missiles on them, now the U.S. Navy can use some high-demand, low-density assets like submarines and not have to worry about the Navy surface fleet, but do other exquisite things with exquisite capability. Now that Navy's got to worry about the U.S. Army, it's got to worry about the U.S. Navy, et cetera. And at AUSA, we had Admiral Harry Harris, the PACOM commander, came on and was talking about this exact same thing. That, if the Army can provide capability to the maritime domain, that really starts to change the equation here. And if they can do it in a way that is very difficult for my adversary's Navy to deal with, in other words, if you can position Army cross-domain fires on sovereign territory of a coalition partner, now the adversary's got to think, okay, I've got to deal with the U.S. Army, and the Army is positioned on sovereign territory of a coalition partner. So if I attack that, I brought that coalition partner into it. Very different than if I've just got to isolate, one ship on the ocean, take it down, and I don't have all the collateral political issues with it. It really changes the calculus of that enemy when they kind of go through their risk-payoff calculus. Now, what does that mean? Actually, it means a lot. Because, in the Army, we've worked for a while since air-land battle with those two domains, air and land. But we have, for instance, when we work with our friends in the Air Force, we have BCDs, battlefield coordination attachments, on how we deconflict air and space, or air and land. What's the BCD to work with the Navy? There really isn't one. What if a U.S. fires battery has capability to operate in the maritime domain, operate in the air domain, operate against UAS, long-range precision fires, land, et cetera, like that? In other words, I have a fires capability, and it operates in all domains. And do I start building cyber in as a part of that, both lethal and non-lethal fires? Because maybe I'm trying to synchronize what I'm doing with cyber in a non-lethal way and follow up with a lethal capability, or I have menus that, again, the commander can select from depending upon what is going on. But then how do I synchronize all that? I mean, how do you synchronize all of those domains? Because if you're doing something in the air domain and you're doing, say, especially if you're doing something with directed energy, you've got to make sure that it's deconflicted with friendly kind of stuff up there, because these things don't necessarily have the constrained SDZs that we're used to with some of our kinetic munitions. So you really have to look at the geometry of the battlefield very differently than sort of I did growing up with just, where's first platoon and where's second platoon, and as long as I stay here, et cetera, like that. So this has huge ramifications across the Army. The full .mil PF suite of capabilities, just like Air-Land Battle did when we went from kind of active defense to maneuver warfare. Now we had to figure out, well, how do you go deep, and how you do air interdiction, and how we do all those things before, when it was just, hey, dig your tanks in here and then wait for the folks to come, then move to supplement alternate positions. Now it's like, no, I want you to maneuver throughout the depth of the enemy. Now I need you to supply. So now what does it mean? And in fact, Nadia and I were just talking. So what is, if this is just one example of one warfighting function fires, cross-domain fires. What does multi-domain medical support look like? What does multi-domain IPB, intelligence preparation of the battlefield, look like? So I was at Fort Huachuca a couple weeks ago talking to General Barrier and the folks there. I don't want just IPB of the Central Corridor. I want a multi-domain IPB. What's going on in all the domains? When can they bring it to bear? And then what's my sit temp per multiple domains for IPB? And then what can I do about it? And how do I organize myself? So this is really just the tip of the iceberg. But what I wanted to do is lay out a little bit the method to the madness. First of all, kind of where we got here. In many ways, we have followed the model, at least at the first order principle level, of what we did with Air-Land Battle, which is take a very serious look of what's going on in the world today, not to refight the world today, but as a harbinger of things to come. What are our enemies trying to do to us, and what have they spent decades, quite honestly? These things are not just flash in the pans. These are some things you can peel back the stuff they have been working for decades on and have made investments for decades to come yet. So we do have a pretty good idea of the kind of things that they're focusing on based what they think. I mean, we are the pacing item for them, for the people around the world that mean our way of life ill. They look at the U.S. military. They study us sometimes even better than we study ourselves, and we are their pacing item. So that it actually is a very good window into the world of what they're doing. And again, then trying to figure out what are the first order problems we're trying to solve. We've got kind of laid out three that when we finally release the report, there'll be more, but this, they want to keep us out of the area of operations. They want to fix us and fracture what we've developed with Air-Land Battle. You can see what they try to do with cyber and electromagnetic stuff. They're just trying to fracture us, trying to fracture our network, trying to fracture our synchronization. So what does this mean for our network? It means it's very critical, but it also means you've got to build it in a way that it's very difficult to fracture, because that's what they're going to come after. Because it's much easier to fracture the network than take out all of your capability there. And so they know it's kind of our Achilles heel. So now it provides us some insights in priorities. What I'd like to do, guys, maybe just transition 10 minutes. Yeah, just open up for questions. Again, tip of the iceberg, but I kind of want to, you've probably seen the slides and stuff, but want to give a little bit of a how we got there kind of thing. And more importantly, where we're going. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
As you work on multi-domain battle, how is that interplaying with capability development? If you're looking at family systems to address these issues, is there sort of a specter of XNet coming out of that?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. When you give presentations like this, there's really three kinds of questions. There are such things as dumb questions. I'm sure I'm not going to get one here today, but believe me, I give a lot of talks and things like that, and there is such a thing as dumb questions. There are good questions. Good questions are ones that bring up very meaty subjects, maybe have a little controversy between them. There's not a clear answer, something like that. And excellent questions are ones that I already have a backup slide made for. So So that's an excellent question, Mark. Big 6 plus 1. Yeah, so again, excellent question. And you weren't a plant, right? So when I was growing up, we had the big 5. Actually, I think we're 63 subsystems underneath it. But the big 5, is that right, Ricky? You're is it 63? All right, yeah. Well, wow, okay. It provide one thing, a focus of senior leaders with regards to not only resourcing, but paying attention, trades. We had a great meeting yesterday in the up in the Army staff. We're talking about the future, and Mike Murray's 8, asked a really important question. Hey, when you give me this list of stuff, is it in order of priority? In other words, what's a priority? Because I always give my friends in the Army staff a huge want list, a huge Christmas list. The holidays are coming. I mean, I got all kinds of things I want to know. What Mike wants to know, well, what are the priorities? Because in the end, you've got to make trades. And that's what the Big 5 did. It provided a focusing effect. So we've got this 6 plus 1. We're working through this with the chief. And so you can see these are 6 plus 1 capabilities, the base one being soldier and team performance, which we think is the bedrock of all success that the Army enjoys. But the one thing different about this than the Big 5 that I grew up with, the Big 5 I grew up with were very specific things, the tank, the Apache, et cetera. And they're great things, and we have them today. These are capabilities, robotics and autonomous systems, not that robot, but systems in general, cross-domain fires, advanced protection. So now we're looking at a capability across the Army versus a very specific thing. So let me talk to this one, robotics and autonomous systems. So again, we were having a great discussion yesterday, and again, and Mike's troop leading us through and saying, well, okay, but we don't have to wait till we have figured everything out. If we know these are priorities, there's things that we can be doing today. In other words, you don't have to figure the whole thing out. You don't have to wait till 2050 to get it. So one of the examples I use, if you think of a capability, I said, as we look to the future, talking about autonomous systems, you could say, you know what, let's take an entire mission set like a breach. Why would we ever have manned systems breaching obstacles and minefields? In other words, you should have entire mission sets. I'm not just buying a robot. I want the ability to conduct an autonomous breach. I should never have a manned system in there probing for mines or doing things like that. Now, what does that mean? Well, when I grew up, you'd have engineers doing that, or infantrymen. Tankers, we wouldn't dismount. We'd just wait till the breach was clear, then we'd assault. But so we would have to obscure them with smoke and all that. So one of the questions I posed, so if you do an autonomous breach, how do you obscure that? Maybe it's not smoke. Maybe it's electromagnetic field. So you have an electronic smoke screen, not a visual smoke screen, because you're not trying to hide soldiers. You're trying to prevent interdiction of your autonomous activity. So if you look at this, what happens is that, some of the challenges maybe aren't necessarily that robot as it was, hey, build an M1 tank. It's what are some things, if you do autonomous operations, that are universal challenges? How do you command and control them? How do you provide data links, everything like that? And then when you back out, a lot of things that are challenges for us for autonomous systems are challenges for the Navy. They're challenges for the Air Force. They are domain non-dependent. So we find if we talk about multi-domain battle, the other advantage is not only are we looking for capability that operates in all domains, we are finding challenges that are similar across all domains. They are non-domain dependent challenges. So when you don't get overly specific to your domain in a particular thing, you start to see, you know what, I could work with Air Force, Navy, Marines, as we are to say, this one thing, this affects all of us. It's sort of ubiquitous. Once we get this perfected, then you can sub-optimize it for a maritime application. You can sub-optimize it for an air application, and we'll sub-optimize it for land. But some of the basics of it are very similar, and that's why we think this approach lends itself much better to our concept of multi-domain battle, the rate of innovation, going after universal capabilities that eventually you turn into specific things. So again, excellent question. Okay, yes, sir. Yeah. Well, we're going to see how this Army-Navy game works out here in a couple of weeks. But, Admiral Harry Harris, PACOM commander, and Bob Brown, the now USAPAC commander, Bob Brown is working via Paycom to putting together a multi-domain exercise. Now, whether an actual ship will end up at the bottom of the ocean, probably not. But we're starting to put together these multi-domain exercises, in the real domain, boots in the dirt, sailors in the ocean, et cetera, like that, to replicate some of these capabilities and see what it means. And so what we're doing, when you talk about multi-domain, you're talking about the Army as one of the domains, but then working with the entire Joint Force coalition partners in combat and the combatant commanders. And so we have exercise this spring with Paycom on that. And the next year we're doing one in U.S. Army Europe with UCOM. And these are going to be the kind of things we're rolling out there, because then you start talking about interoperability with coalition partners through all of the domains. So it's one of those things, the more you exercise it, the more you realize you got a lot to do. Sydney, you had one more. You're the official last question, Sydney.
Thank you. Sydney, one of the things I've noticed about, you mentioned this, while the other people will talk about this, that instead of, I'd say, rolling back the whole HTTP bubble,
yeah,
the idea is you slip in there and you're creating windows of opportunity that may close very quickly.
Yes.
And there may be a moment when you have your network working and
yeah.
practice across main fires. There may be a moment where you are wandering around the dark with your map. There may be moments where you have air superiority, and there may be moments where some kind of evil robot is over there.
Right.
So, given this preference for very methodical battle,
yeah,
how do we change the culture of the .LCF, the way we build equipment to take advantage of any opportunity?
Yeah, so that's also an excellent question. It's not even a backup slide. I'll go back to the original multi-domain slide, Mark, if you can go to that. And that's one of the big things we're looking at, the problems when you start to peel the onion back. So what you end up with, as you laid out there, you more than likely could have a very high level of dispersion of forces, of which got to a position of relative advantage when the window of domain superiority was open, and then it closed. So now what do you do? Well, what we're finding is there's a couple of things that become the long pole in the tent. The first one is protection. How do you protect them? Because a lot of the way we get protection is sort of by mass and formation, all that. And then the other one is sustainment, medical. How do you medically evacuate folks, et cetera, like that. So actually, that protection and sustainment sometimes become a bigger challenge than the lethality piece that we focus on a lot. So now we're saying, you know what? I've got to look at reducing my sustainment load that I put in the system. My forces, energy efficiency, Ms. Hammock's been working with us and others, we have to reduce our sustainment demand on the system, because they very may well have to operate someplace for extended periods of time, and we won't have continuous line of communication between them. So that's a physical aspect. But from a .mil-PF point of view, the training and leader development, it may be lieutenant, captain, lieutenant general, whatever. You're going to go out there, and what we say is you may not have constant connectivity, but we want you to have the ability to constantly execute mission command, which is execute commander's intent, which means that when you give orders and guidance, you've got to give them broad enough, and this is quintessential mission command, our doctrine, that you have to realize you've got to create the visualization so that probably when and if you lose communications and all that, they still understand commander's intent, and that they can operate for periods of time of not connectivity, but that doesn't mean that they don't have constant understanding of intent and what's going on. So there's a training and leader development part to that, and then it gets back to the network. You've got to take out a lot of the fragility and say, I have a lot of ways to regain this. I've lost it this way, but I've got other ways to regain that, or I only need to have connectivity for a certain amount of time. I gain situational awareness, and then I don't need connectivity, but that is good for a certain amount of time, and then I regain it again. So you make a great point that people have to be very comfortable not having continuous communication, yet a continuous understanding of the battlefield.